I think most of us have a real different view and opinion and feeling toward the idea of a command or a commandment than the people in Jesus' day, the Jews especially. See, the Jews had built their life around what they call the 10 words. We call them the 10 Commandments. You find them in Exodus chapter 20. They are the bones, the strong, good bones of God's design for how life works when you're in community with other people. There were 360 some other points of the law, but the commandments, these 10 words, were, I think, one of the reasons God did it the way he did it is because you can keep 10 commandments in your head all at one time. You can't think about them all at one time, but you can keep them in your file drawer where you can get to them. 360 some, that's a whole lot, and a lot of people couldn't keep them always at the front of their mind. So anyway, we have a real different view of commands. For the Israelites, for the Jews, a command was a word from God that they assumed, since it was from God, was for their best benefit. All the commands that God gave in the Old Testament had a practical application for a practical reason. And it would be interesting to take all 10 of these commandments and kind of break them out as to, so what would be the practical application and the value, practical value of these commandments? How could each of these commands, keeping these commandments, make my life better? But we're not going to do that today because that would take a long time. I do, though, have to say, for most Americans, the idea of a commandment kind of makes us bristle. We are independent people. We feel and act on our independence. And I think that's not evil or anything. I just think sometimes it's a hindrance when we think about whose will, whose design do we commit ourselves to and then follow. This is difficult for a Christian. John writes about God's commands, and we talked a little bit about that last time from 2 John verse 4, where he said, "It has given me great joy to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as the Father commands us." And then he goes on in verse 5, "And now, dear lady, I am not writing you a new command, but one we have had from the beginning. I ask that we love one another." Tradition holds that in John's final years, he was old. Of all the apostles, he lived the longest. And as far as we have tradition and record, he's the only one who didn't die the death of a martyr. He died of old age. Many scholars believe that he was in his 90s, and he was fragile and old and often had to be carried into the meetings of the church. And when he was carried in, he would say, "My dear children, love one another." This was his mantra. This was his trademark. Love one another. I'm not writing you a new command, but one we have had from the beginning. I ask that we love one another. Well, that wasn't a new command by the time John wrote these letters, but at one point it was a new command. You find this in John 13, 34 and 35, where Jesus was with the disciples, And he said, I'm giving you a new command, that you would love one another as I have loved you. This is there's at least two things about this we got to consider. First of all, Jesus said that you would love one another as I have loved you. And my initial take is, in the way I have loved you. When you think about that, the way Jesus loved us was unconditionally, sacrificially, unselfishly. Wow, that's tall order. I find all three of those things difficult in my life. The second way, and I don't think this gets looked at very often, but it's worth a pause for, as I have loved you, would be to look at it in the sense I have loved you. So, as I've loved you, love one another. Since I have loved you, love one another. And so we have both the motive and the model for loving one another. And Jesus goes on in verse 35 of John 13 and says, this is how all men will know. And these days, we have to translate that all mankind, all people will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. So we have the motive, we have the model, and now Jesus says we have the mark. Well, that'd make a nice 3-point sermon, wouldn't it? But lucky you, I'm not going to preach it. I'm just going to say, by the time John writes in his second letter, this is not a new commandment, but it's an old one. It had been around, by the time John wrote this, it had been around 70, 80, maybe as many as 90 years. Love each other. I want to just, pause and ask, how many of the difficulties that you see around you in your life would be changed if this thing about loving one another was actually happening? I try to not be very politically minded, but I'm sorry, I often fail. And sometimes when I think about the controversy and conflict and acrimony over political issues, the hatred that I see expressed on social media, and the kind of extreme kinds of things that are said to one person to another over a political situation, I just think, man, if you love each other, what does that look like? When you apply this, we're in the context of political disagreement. I really do think it's possible for me to not agree with you, or you to not agree with me on our political views, and still love one another. If that's possible, what would that look like? Well, it's not rocket science, but you do have to think a little bit about it. People who love each other, one of the ways this is expressed, and one of the marks of this, is they have regard for each other. And it's not just any old regard, it's positive regard. They begin with a belief that the other is worthy. Well, if I begin with that belief, how I treat your ideas will be different than if my beginning point is, you're an idiot, you always have been, you always will be. See, we have to enter the conversation with a bias. And the bias is, you're valuable, and so your opinion should be valued by me. even if I don't agree with it, even, and this is hard, even if I can give you substantial reasons why your opinion isn't right. So one of the marks of loving one another is treating one another with positive regard. So that my bias for you is not that you're wrong, you're out of order, it's not negative, but it's positive. Another aspect of this, when I love one another, is that we're in a reciprocating relationship. Now, I don't love you in order that I'll get love back from you, but it is kind of a pretty well established law of relationships. When I love you, I am much more likely to get love back from you. Now, this is not always the case. Jesus loved the Pharisees and was always in conflict with them. He seemed to not get this reciprocating love from them, except for a couple: Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea. There were people who reciprocated his love, his positive regard. But let's be honest. Who put Jesus to death? Those Pharisees. At their instigation, at their engineering. And so, it sometimes doesn't work out perfectly. There's always this human element. And however, I will say, look into your own personal relationships. When you extend love, it sets you in a position where you are more likely to receive love. Here's an aspect of this principle, this process that we can't overlook. To love someone requires vulnerability. When it is possible to love someone in a limited sort of way, in a guarded sort of way, to love them to whatever degree we have confidence that we can trust that they will not hurt us, right? I don't think that's always wrong. I'm grateful that God doesn't, his love for us is not conditioned in that way. All his defenses are down, which he can afford. I get that. I mean, he's God. He can do anything he wants to. For me, I struggle with, and I trust God to be at work. I believe he is, and I think he's going to continue to work to give me stability, confidence, depth, maturity to take the risk of loving another. And the risk is that when I love them, they may not love me back. Second risk: in order to experience love, and I talk a lot about the kind of this dichotomy between feeling and thinking. And I generally opt for thinking. I don't want to assassinate feeling, though. And in this case, when the context of love, for me to feel loved, I have to feel that my needs are being met. At the very least, that my needs are being accounted for, are being addressed. Now, step back from that and realize that how can anyone address my needs if they don't know what my needs are? How does that work with the risk I'm talking about? Well, it's pretty simple. I have to risk revealing to you that I have needs, and that is a risk of vulnerability, because what it says is, I'm weak in this area. Well, it's what we think it says. I don't think it says that so much as when you address this need, I feel loved. If you're in a relationship with anybody, today I want you to evaluate, to what degree are you willing and able to take the risk to love them and to share with them what you feel your needs are so that they can love you. No relationship will not be grown, deepened, strengthened by that. Time's up. Well, more than up. And I'm going to sign off. I'll see you next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.